I had been walking for days. The strangest thing about this school was that it was always in view, but it never seemed to get closer. On the first night of this journey, I'd been surrounded by a family of wolves after I'd set up camp. Surrounded, but never attacked. They just paced and watched me. I was warned that it would be impossible to tell what was real and what was the school, so I had no plans of interacting with them anyway. And they kept appearing, more and more wolves every night. At first they seemed antsy and agitated, but by the fourth night, they would just come to my campsite and lay down just outside the campfire's ring of light. It wasn't until the fifth night that I came up with a theory. It was possible that I was the least dangerous entity on this path at night, and they were warming up to the idea that I wasn't a threat to them. But that was just a layman's thinking. I had no way of knowing if it was right or not. Well, not no way. If I really wanted to know if they were real, interacting with them would get me an answer pretty quickly. The only trouble is, I'd potentially end up interacting with one of the path's many tests of fortitude. The path was defined by its tests, and it seemed to never run out of permutations. And once you can't handle the test, you wake up back where you started. Incredibly frustrating, but also a bit of a relief. It was very clear that the school didn't want to punish potential students as much as it wanted to show us where our weaknesses lay. But what is a weakness? Is my choice to save an apparition of a small old woman a lack of focus on my goals, or a need to self-sacrifice? The path would never say. You just wake up, back at the beginning. And after 6 months of trying, you start to learn a few useful tricks, like my don't interact with the wildlife trick. The wolves were just as likely to be a lesson on fear as they were to be actual wolves. The path itself was a single stretch of road, surrounded on both sides by a never-ending sea of red roses. Straying off the path seemed to be a guaranteed way to end up with a series of tests thrown at you, so staying on it was key. But it didn't seem to make much difference what I tried, which is why I was surprised to see the school in the distance looking much closer on the 7th day of traveling. Was it a trick of the light? As I wondered whether this was some kind of test, I saw a small cottage in the distance, just off the road. Clearly some kind of test, but one I'd never seen before. What was the point of having a house on the road? Was it to test my courage? To see if I was willing to explore the inside? As I got closer, I saw the front door open and a young woman wandering onto the house's porch. I couldn't quite make out what she was doing, but I walked up to the house and introduced myself. She seemed startled by my presence, but polite enough. I asked her what she was doing here, and she told me she wasn't sure. That was even stranger. Typically, tests had a particular structure that was easily identified in hindsight. A request, an instinct, something that compelled you to action. But this young woman didn't seem interested in getting me to do anything. I figured that the safest thing to do was to disregard this out-of-place cottage and continue with my journey. Which is why I was discouraged to find out that once I'd kept walking for 30 minutes, long after the cottage was out of sight, I would stumble onto an identical cottage with an identical young woman. I asked her if she remembered me, and she said she did. But honestly, her memory didn't seem to be a strength of hers, so I took her words at face value. So either she was the test, or what, she was trapped here? I can't imagine that's possible. A school that kidnapped its applicants? That seemed insane even by magic school standards. As I kept walking, I started to think about how both of these options were a challenge to deal with. If she was a test, what exactly is she testing for? My willingness to help strangers? My bias towards helping women as opposed to men? My boredom with the current journey? Too many options. And if I didn't know what the question was, how could I improve my answer the next time around? And if she is trapped here, I'm not exactly sure how I would help her. Would I need to get her to interact with a test on the path? This place was so overly complex sometimes. I continued down the path the next few days and ran into her again and again, always at random points throughout my journey. Eventually, we developed a sort of familiarity. Sometimes I would wave at her as I walked by. Other times I would stop and talk to her about the day. Her days were uneventful, typically, which is why I was surprised when one day she came out of the house and flagged me down. She had a rather serious look on her face. Had something happened? She asked me if I was hungry at all. And there it was. Well, that settles the "is she a test" question. Tests would have points, and this seemed to be rather pointless. I knew better than to rely on the path for food, so I'd learned a rather complex bit of magics that turned sunlight into sustenance. It was incredibly tedious to perform, highly precise, and had a series of drawbacks, but it did make hunger impossible, which was incredibly useful at this stage on the path. I explained all of this to the woman, and she nodded along, apologizing for delaying me. I told her that it was all right. She had no way of knowing I didn't need anything to eat. We didn't have much to say after that, so I mentioned that I should get back on the road, and she agreed. I waved goodbye, and she went back inside. And then I woke up. Well, not woke up, since it's not like I was asleep. It was more like I snapped into consciousness, back at the start of the journey. I'm not ashamed to say that I lost my temper a bit, but in my defense, it didn't make any sense. It was clear the woman had been a test all along, but what had I done wrong? She wasn't a threat, as far as I could tell. I'd spoken to her so many times, and nothing seemed odd about her. Maybe she had some piece of information that I needed? Something that would break the cycle. I had no idea what kind of information she could have, but it was worth investigating. Just not today. Being reset by the path always felt like waking up from a vivid dream, and I was only able to grasp at vague memories of my time on it. As I headed back to my camp up the road, I was already forgetting what the woman looked like. Still, I was able to cling to certain feelings I'd had during my journey. I remembered being fearful, but calm around a fire. I must have built something to defend myself at night. I was starting to piece together the mystery of my last attempt, and I realized I had a few challenges to prepare for. When I arrived back at my tent, I pulled out my journal and started to sift through my notes. 6 months ago, I didn't know the first thing about basic enhancement magics. Now, I was combining and reinforcing magics that I hadn't thought about in years, experimenting with different ways to prepare myself for the path. It wasn't uncommon for me to tinker for a week before trying again, and since my memories of the path were getting fuzzier and fuzzier, I knew that I was getting further every time. Suddenly, I got a flash of that woman again. Not of her face, but more of how it felt to speak with her. There must have been a test involved at some point with her. Was she helping me with it? Or was she part of it? I wrote and wrote for hours, building my way forward through the haze of that half-remembered dream, long after the sun had set.